Modernist Society of North America. I'm here because we are in the midst of a potentially monumental ecological crisis. It is only through a new environmentalism 2.0 that progress can be made. We believe that our only hope for human advancement and even human survival is through the exponential advance of science in the service of humanity. We stand firmly against the war on science that is predicated on the appeal to nature fallacy, which is the belief that whatever is natural must be good and whatever is unnatural must be bad. This belief has become an impediment to advances in areas such as human health, social progress, and even environmental progress. In the field of medicine, the appeal to nature fallacy has already led to catastrophic outcomes. Resistance to vaccines threatens public health and the lives of children. The unwarranted resistance to GMOs has not only held back the fight against climate change, but it has also hampered our ability to feed the developing world as well. Campaigns against GMOs have also held back efforts to ward off the deadly Aedes aegypti mosquito, which has killed countless millions as a carrier of disease and plagues. The scientific consensus concerning the safety of GMOs is solidly supported in every major scientific organization across the planet. The only thing green about being anti-GMO is the extra cash that is made by overcharging for expensive boutique food. But that won't cut it when it comes to raising crops with accelerating heat stress, droughts, floods, disease, and insect infestations brought on by a hotter planet. It makes no sense to accept the call of the IPCC for decarbonization within the next 12 years and yet reject their conclusion that these goals are impossible without nuclear power, which has proven itself to be the cleanest, safest, and most reliable way of achieving decarbonization. It is the most reliable way to decarbonize simply because the alternatives of weather-dependent power sources are inherently unreliable. And nuclear is the cleanest energy source because it is the only form of energy production that completely encases its waste stream. Super safe, advanced Generation 4 reactors, which will almost completely convert existing nuclear waste to centuries worth of energy, are coming very close to commercialization. In fact, it goes completely against most everything we're led to believe, but nuclear is legitimately the safest form of energy generation according to all the accepted worldwide energy fatality data. But there is one thing that nuclear is not safe for, and that is the fossil fuel industry. The fact of the matter is that the fossil fuel industry has a long history of funding the anti-nuclear movement, along with climate change deniers, to protect their bottom line. Solid science is in dire need of a champion. And that is what eco-modernism is all about. Eco-modernism is a new environmental paradigm which looks to reverse the fear of nuclear power and scientific progress in general. Ecology-based modernism is the most direct way to define it. Eco-modernism as a philosophy is described in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. We believe humanity should not be rejecting technological progress, but rather separate our impacts from nature through the responsible use of technology and urbanization. Urbanization is an unstoppable worldwide trend and the best solution to many environmental problems. It offers sustainable development for the human population and is a historic antidote to both deforestation and species extinction, as humans move away from using wildlife as their protein source. Vertical, urban, high-rise architecture minimizes the use of land, resources, and energy, enabling walkable cities that facilitates the more efficient use of mass public transit as well. It must be emphasized that our support for technological solutions is definitely not about defending industrial polluters, nor do we accept funding from corporations or industry. Nor does our defense of technology imply that we just need to sit back and let things take care of themselves. To the contrary, we believe that humanity is at a crossroads that severely threatens our future on this planet. We reject the idea of resource limits on many levels. The advance of science has a long history of getting around problems of resource scarcity and will continue to do so. Another reason is that Earth is just one of a multitude of worlds available to explore in our solar system and beyond. comets, and asteroids are untapped reservoirs for raw materials. If we could find a way to thrive in artificial ecosystems off-world, we could use what we learn to help sustain terrestrial ecosystems here on Earth. I hope by now you understand the worthiness of our cause. Ecomodernism is really only a philosophy at this time. I want to talk to you about the necessity of turning it into a movement, which will be part of the larger environmentalist movement. For it is only through our presence and participation that there can be any hope of moving environmentalism in the right direction. Our aim is not to divide the environmental movement, but rather to multiply its numbers with the incorporation of many scientific and educational communities that is working to both build chapters of eco-modernist societies and support our growth worldwide. We aspire to increase our numbers by bringing together the numerous supporters of climate action that have been alienated by mainstream environmentalism's wildly contradictory support for the shutting down of nuclear power plants in the midst of a climate emergency, and welcome them into our ranks. Thank you.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, EcoModern channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, EcoModern Society of North America.
On another planet That's where it stays. Freedom, just a word they say. Freedom, just a word they say. Let me tell you something about this world I see. With my own two eyes, 20/20 vision. Let me tell you something, brother, about you and me. There's no such a thing called freedom, just a word they say. Freedom is in heaven, that's where it stays.
Hello and welcome to the program. This is the Eco-Modernist Channel Live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm here with Gabe Ignetti and our special guests. Today we are speaking with Robert Steinhaus and Matt Wald. Matt was a reporter for 38 years at the New York Times, where he covered climate, energy, and other subjects. He is an analyst for the Breakthrough Institute, specializing in nuclear energy. Robert Steinhaus is a retired staff member with the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He was involved in engineering for the atmospheric nuclear tests performed at the Nevada test site. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We
And
are-
by the way,
Go ahead.
worked at the New York Times for 38 years. That's important.
So
Was
we've
reporting.
had quite the last few weeks, of course, following the United States striking 3 nuclear sites in Iran with bunker-busting bombs, following a air campaign from Israel, following retaliatory strikes from Iran. The context of time we find ourselves in is, of course, Iran's nuclear program. We covered a bit of this last week, where Iran began with a significant number of, or a fair number, I should say, not to be too technical, a fair number of centrifuges, and literally significant quantities of uranium, enriched uranium, as well as uranium past the 5% mark. Now, before the bombings, we had confirmations that Iran had reached 60% uranium enrichment. How do we respond to Iranian claims that that program is purely civilian and a pursuit of nuclear energy?
Carl, I've spent a long time writing about civilian nuclear energy and various nuclear technologies. You don't need 60% enrichment for the civilian stuff. There was minor use of high enriched uranium to make one medical isotope, but we've switched out of that to use lower enrichments for non-proliferation reasons. We also had some research reactors around the United States that used high enriched uranium, and we've switched those to low enriched uranium also, specifically because you don't want the stuff to be diverted into military use. There just isn't a military use for this stuff. There's a political use for the stuff. You can bluff, bluster, gain influence, gain prestige, etc. And I think that's what's really been happening.
Yeah, I would also like to mention that up until 2018, Iran had been quite circumspect and had observed IAEA demands, or they certainly engaged in activity that stayed below, the required enrichment levels of the JCPOA. And it was only after President Trump unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA that Iran began, enriching to these higher levels. So we could have had, low enrichment activities out of Iran for another decade or two if we had stayed with the JCPOA. This conundrum that we find ourselves in today is in part a result of unilateral actions by President Trump in 2018.
Is there any mechanism by which we knew that Iran was complying, or like how do we know that all of this is still true?
Yeah, Iran is probably one of the most heavily inspected or regularly inspected countries in the world. There are very few countries that have the same level of scrutiny by IAEA inspectors as Iran, and Iran doesn't have that many nuclear reactors, only a couple. So there is, there's at least some reason to claim that we probably know most of what's happening on the commercial reactor level, at least about Iran. And we've also had multiple occasions for very smart guys that are very quick at picking up on any details that look like, weapons proliferation or diversion. We've got our guys into Iran, into the actual sensitive facilities over and over again over a course of more than a decade, or at least since the JCPOA started. And those guys were not picking up, the telltale signs of there being a diversion or material going into weapons. So I'm inclined to just follow that, rather than second guess it. That's just my inclination. I of course haven't been on the ground. I haven't been to those sites. I actually am not trained in looking for the specific things that inspectors are trained for. So my opinion, just is an opinion, and I maybe should leave it at that. But I would like to point out those facts that if you're really worried about, high enrichments, we could have had it. We did have it reliably. And there was no evidence that the Iranians were breaking any of the elements of the JCPOA. It is we who diverged from.
They were holding up their side of the bargain. Yes.
They were holding it up, and that deserves to be said.
And now we've gone to the second method of preventing it, which is bombing.
Yeah, that's not a terrific method, in my opinion. That's fraught with all kinds of worry. And I regret that. I think we could have gotten more mileage out of the JCPOA and at least delayed matters for another decade or two before all of this had to come up.
What is the effect of the bombing on our ability to return to the JCPOA?
Right. Well, once again, I hope that this isn't an inappropriate view. I should say at the beginning that the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory never let me speak in public for the laboratory. They had smarter guys, better guys to do that job. My job was mostly as a field test engineer, actually making nuclear tests, work and complete on time and things like that. I had a lot of technical issues, instrumenting tests and all that sort of thing. But when it came to getting up in front of a camera and actually making sensitive, nuanced statements to the public regarding the affairs that were important to the laboratory, they had guys like Lowell Wood and other really top flight, skillful guys, to do that. So I just want to preface my little statements with that fact that nothing here is other than just my personal opinion and has nothing to do with the laboratory, and hopefully won't bring shame on the engineering department. So really, I think the Iranian attack is going to have some unfortunate consequences. That's my own read on it. I believe that as a result of the attacks on Fordo and the other sites, we have an increased likelihood that Iran will switch from having enriched to a uncomfortable but not weapons level to actually just pushing it right through to full weapons level in the next couple of weeks. That's at least what I would do. And quite frankly, Iran has been pretty circumspect up to now in observing rules that have been placed on it, and keeping their agreements is really what it comes down to. They don't have the same record of kind of duplicity and oh, they really do seem to follow through on what they say they're going to do. So I would just like to point that out, and it's my hope that the situation stays stable, and it is most stable probably for the region if Iran doesn't get a weapon. If Iran gets a weapon, then Saudi Arabia and several of the other, very wealthy Arab nations will probably also go for a weapon at some point. So we can stop a lot of proliferation and destabilization in the region if we are somehow successful at convincing Iran not to take the final steps, which they've been reluctant to do, anyway. There was in early 2000s, I think 2003, there was a fatwa, which is a kind of religious decree by the supreme leader that all weapons of mass destruction were essentially off the table. It was not in consonance with the teachings of the Quran and Sharia law. So I'm inclined to believe that they really believe that, whereas our politicians are motivated by other motivations, not typically by Sharia law or by fatwas. In Iran, I think they really are sincere, at least to a level. I mean, it's not to say they can't be nudged out of it, but I think there is some sincerity in their position of not wanting to go to weapons of mass destruction if it possibly can be avoided. So,
Robert, I think
maybe I'm
it would,
naive, maybe people will criticize me, but that is my suspicion, at least, that instead of just being drunk on power, and seeing the military solution as the first choice in all cases, and being well, anyway, I think that Iran is actually trying to hold back, and
Robert, I think it would be wrong
I
to
guess
say
we'll
that
see
there's
if I'm
no
right.
American equivalent to a fatwa. Uh, But also, Carl, your question was about returning to the table. It may depend in part on who's in charge. Both Iran and the United States are led by elderly men who won't be around forever. The Iranian situation is complicated because there's been terrific damage, terrific number of people killed, not so much by the American bombing, but by the associated Israeli bombing. And one of the things that would change the dynamic is regime change in Iran, which is worrisome, but yet more worrisome if they have nuclear weapons, and eventually changes in who leads the United States and Israel.
And that is politically very a very touchy subject, of course. Is that to say that regime change is one of the stronger options to truly prevent an escalation of nuclear proliferation in the region?
I don't think the United States has tried with mixed results to control who's in charge of Iran. We created the Shah. We brought the Shah to power by overthrowing a democratically elected government in 1954, I believe. Uh, the Iran will have some turnover simply because Ayatollah Khamenei has been in power for so long and is quite elderly. Uh, what follows isn't clear. There's a lot of domestic unrest in Iran. I don't think we're going to get to choose. I think the Iranians are going to get to choose, and that's probably as it should be.
So to be clear, your article, the subtitle is about how thick fog of war is in this situation. Are are we harming the interests of America by continuing, by initiating and continuing a military action in Iran?
So this article was on the Breakthrough Institute website,
Yeah.
and in Substack, and it's kind of not about the politics. It's about the physical processes, what's happened, what hasn't happened, what would have to happen. And I didn't come down with a judgment about whether this was a good idea or a bad idea. It's unfortunate to be pushed into this choice. I think Robert is completely correct. We could have had a diplomatic option, but we walked away from that years ago. Uh, but Robert, another thing you said was they could enrich further. It's not much of a leap to get from 60% to bomb grade, but it's not clear to us at this moment. It may be clear in Iran, it may not be. How much of the enriched material survived the bombing, whether they have the centrifuges to do that job, whether they have the equipment to return the uranium to metal form. It's enriched in the form of uranium hexafluoride, which is this kind of sludge you heat into a gas to put into the centrifuge. And there are a few other steps you'd have to go through. I'd also like to make the point that it's fairly easy to make a bomb. It's harder to make a bomb that'll fit on a warhead. At the moment, the Iranians don't have an air force, don't have air defenses, can't send an airplane to drop a bomb, which, by the way, is what the United States did with the first nuclear weapons used in combat. They could blow one up in the desert somewhere just to gain prestige, make them feel good, solidify the domestic regime's position, um, raise the power profile of the Shiite side of the divide in the Middle East. Uh, but that would be different from actually having a deliverable weapon.
I would like to point out that one of the possibilities is to bring a bomb in on a ship, perhaps in a cargo container, something of that nature. That is within the technical capability of Iran, and it is possible to ship a cargo container with a device, essentially through several ports, so you can kind of mask the source. I'm sure that if it was a critical undertaking, the means could be found to cover and to conceal the source of the special cargo container. Anyway, shipping a cargo container to Haifa is certainly something that is not out of the realm of possibility. And that would be actually one way that I would consider if I was in the position of Iran and wanted to deliver a message to Israel. That's one way I'd consider doing it.
Can you tell us more about the detection capability? Is are we able to do anything about these materials, the components or the fissile material needed to make a bomb? How easy is it, or how difficult is it to detect any number of these constituent parts?
One of the complications is HEU is not terrifically radioactive.
Correct.
Uranium's a pretty stable isotope. It's got a half-life in the millions of years. I did see in the Port of Baltimore a portal monitor, a giant U-shaped object that ran back and forth on rails or tires and could be moved over a standard shipping container and was looking for radiation. You end up detecting things like radiation from Italian floor tile, or other things that are not actually threats. It has a false positive rate, and the volume of shipments is so large, it gets complicated. But Robert may have a clearer idea. There are detection facilities protecting the United States, some of which are known, and I hope some of which are unknown. I hope they've got more than what they're telling us about.
We only scan about 4% of the cargo containers that come into the United States, and a huge number of cargo containers do come in. The Port of Los Angeles itself receives about 6 million cargo containers a year. And in 2005, we actually had legislation, a Safe Ports bill that passed, and it required that agencies of DOE come up with a scheme for reliably scanning 100% of all the containers that come into the United States. And there was a division within DOE, it's called UNDO, that is actually a sub kind of agency within DOE that is involved in the design of, portal scanners, and was tasked with the task of coming up with an effective means of preventing, a weapon coming in inside a cargo container. Sad facts are that UNDO has not had success in really coming up with decent technology. It's a reasonably challenging job, and actually they got help from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. We had a project where we, tried to come up with the best that we knew of how to approach the task. They did come up with technology, but the agency, DNDO, they kind of wanted to do their own thing. So they kind of riffed off of the LLNL effort, and they went through two iterations of design and implementation, and neither of those designs were satisfactory to the point where they were economical and reasonable to deploy. So that is a sad story. We still are pretty much uncovered. If you actually look at the facts, it would be easy. If we give people reasons to want to send us a message, in the form of a nuclear weapon inside of a cargo container, we treat people around the world shabbily enough to where their rage is at a level that they just simply want to send you something. I'm afraid we don't have defenses against that. We don't have anything that would prevent, a very serious event that would basically destroy an entire port and kill most of the people in that port. And also, if it's a significant economic port, like, say, the Port of Los Angeles, which a lot of economic activity is connected with those 6 million cargo containers, it could actually reduce, in the at least estimate of LLNL analysts, it could reduce the GNP of the United States by about 25% for 2 years. That was their guess of the impact of putting a weapon into that port. So, so those are all facts that are not widely publicized, but I think are significant and deserve to be mentioned.
And is the Iranian program within striking distance of that capability?
Well, I think that is a matter of discussion, and it gets discussed a lot. Uh, I I would like to be a little conservative on this, because really the truth is, I should be upfront in saying I'm not a weapons designer, and this is more of a weapons design question. So it's good not to pose as a source of all knowledge, especially in a technical area. I have some knowledge, but that knowledge is mostly with respect to, efforts that ended in 1992, and several dozen, like test shots, out of at a test site. It's not with respect to current activity.
So we're beyond the question of if uranium purity, the uranium enrichment level, is a concern for this program.
Well,
yeah,
I'm not certain that's the case. They You can build a bomb with significantly less than 90% enrichment. It just has to be a bigger bomb to get a critical mass, but you have to do more enrichment work. You have to convert the stuff back to a metal. This is a recipe for cat and mouse, more bombing on our part, more trying to suppress their program. They may not, in fact, be there yet, but they're not all that far away, is I think the way I'd put it.
I'd
So
also like to say that the public hasn't been really informed to any extent on fissile devices. There is a class of weapon that's not normally desirable from the standpoint of the military, which is a low yield, low enrichment, device like Matt was just describing. Um, we tend to put that in the same category as a dirty bomb or something like that. But the truth is, a fizzle device is probably a lot more significant, and especially from a economic standpoint. This economic impact of a fizzle device is
FIZZLE.
you got it. That's the guy. And it is mentioned, but I don't think it's given the respect that it deserves. It is a real possibility. Certainly 60% enrichment material is excellently capable of producing a very deliverable, not deliverable from a missile, but deliverable by a ship or in a cargo container. You could get a device into a cargo container that was made with 60% material that would be an excellent fizzle device. And that would spread radiation across a wide area. At the Nevada test site in the mid-1950s, we had a series of tests called GMX. And GMX was basically a series that Los Alamos conducted to study the edges of what works, in fission explosions. We knew we had a formula for something that would work reliably, but we didn't know how far you can change this parameter, how far you can change that parameter, and still have, a effective device. And so GMX actually, had 24 shots. They were mostly smaller shots, and those shots, most of them were kind of semi-failures, or a good portion of them were. And what would happen when you had a failure, you would have a fizzle, typically a low yield explosion. And the result of the low yield explosion was blowing a lot of molten uranium or plutonium and a lot of fission products across about a mile or so, maybe 2 miles of area. And what we discovered is that that material was very, very hard to remove. If you were to actually look at the test site today and do nuclear counting, the parts of the site that are most contaminated are those areas where we had GMX experiments that basically produce fizzle explosions. It's not the big, atmospheric tests that made enormous, clouds and things of that nature that still have high radiation levels, in the areas of the towers. It's actually these small fizzle devices that were intended to allow us to study, the limits of fission. And those are the ones that are still present, in terms of high levels of contamination that you have to be careful around and avoid.
So can we compare this to a dirty bomb? Something that Jim Conca has said is that the achievable version of a dirty bomb in previous decades under a proper IAEA inspections regime is not really an enormous concern to the public. But this sounds like it is a step up from that. This is not only spreading uranium and cesium around a port. This is a sizable explosive device that creates fission products.
Right, it definitely does. And I think you've characterized it right. It is a step up from a dirty bomb, definitely. And it's much more difficult to clean up. If we were able to clean up the test site easily and cost effectively, we would have done it, decades ago. But the test site is still pretty heavily contaminated in those areas. The fission products that produced are fresh fission products instead of being something that's aged for a while that somebody building a dirty bomb, got his hands on. So those fission products are very highly radioactive. And so for a period of some weeks at least, and actually, LNL, Lawrence Livermore analysts, kind of see it being possibly a couple years, maybe 2 years or so, that if you blew it up in a key place, like say, major marine port is the classic one, but if you chose stock exchange or a seat of government or something like that, if you if you deployed one of those devices there, it would have far more impact than the explosive yield of the device, which would be pretty modest. We're talking, tons of TNT yield instead of kilotons or megatons.
We're actually fairly poorly set up for this too, because we don't have rational standards about how clean is clean. As Robert can tell us, you can detect radiation in excruciatingly small quantities. You could clean up a public place to the extent that the dose that people would receive would be tiny, but it would still be an uncomfortable feeling that might make the place unusable because, my God, there's still radiation there. I wanted to go back to an interesting passage in Thomas Power's biography of Werner Heisenberg, the German uh, nuclear physicist who was at the head of Hitler's nuclear program. After the war, the British rounded up all the Nazi scientists and interned them in an estate in England, which they bugged. And they gave the German scientists the BBC radio, other contact with the outside world, and they listened to the report of the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The initial radio reports of those bombings did not say how those weapons arrived. Heisenberg said to his fellow scientists, picked up by these bugs the British had installed, why did the Japanese let an American ship into the harbor to blow up a nuclear bomb there? How could they be so stupid? Heisenberg and his team had missed the point that to make a good bomb, you need neutron reflectors. You can reduce the amount of material needed by reflecting the neutrons, the subatomic particles that split atoms, back into the core. The idea of a ship bomb or a truck bomb has been around for a long time. I rather think the more likely thing we're going to see from the Iranians is a test, a demonstration in the desert somewhere, which is also going to create worldwide, if not panic, at least high anxiety, because all of that radiation will be traceable, even if the area in which it can be detected is far, far larger than the area in which it is meaningful.
Why don't you tell us
Possible.
a little more about? Yeah, please, Robert. Tell us a little bit more about what we'll be able to detect from that kind of a demonstration. We had an enormous amount of protests in the 60s and 70s about nuclear fallout and nuclear weapons. Are we sort of going to return to that environmental regime?
Yeah, and the French doing the last atmospheric tests in Polynesia and the last Chinese test in Lop Nor, wherever it was.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, certainly we have pretty advanced techniques for detecting nuclear tests. There are people at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory that specialize in that and have done set up field stations essentially to look at, seismic disturbances and potential nuclear tests, and they can sort out what is seismic and what is probably, to a high degree of probability, a nuclear test. So I'm very sure that we would know if Iran actually did try a test. And I would expect Iran to try an underground test, to just use well, maybe not. I mean, from a political standpoint, it might be nice to make a statement with a atmospheric test.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Okay, well, maybe so, but I think that the Supreme Leader, the Ayatollah, I think he would be inclined not to want to mess up his own territory with a atmospheric test. I mean, you can get the same information from an underground test or probably a tunnel shot. They already have some tunnels up in the mountains in Iran, and you could just choose one of them and make a horizontal tunnel shot like we used to at the Nevada test site. We had 80 tunnel shots, and there you can put military equipment and other things inside and look at the impact of explosion on anticipated battlefield conditions. And, I think that would still be impressive. If you want to, you can invite the leaders of people, of countries in the area to come and view your test. It would all be pretty high anxiety because I think President Trump would be inclined to just send in another bombing run if word of this came out. So I'm not sure how you do it without inviting the wrath of, the Orange Man, but he, that would be something for higher ups to arrange. Certainly, technically, it could be done. And, I really actually mostly spent my time in underground testing. The only connection I have to atmospheric testing is a little bit out on the Marshall Islands and a little bit looking at the environmental impacts of the 1950s atmospheric tests at Nevada test sites. So maybe I have a bias for underground testing. It really does encapsulate all of the radiation rather effectively, and you can get all the information you need about the effectiveness of your weapon up to a limiting size, which is pretty large, but if you had an enormous device, then an atmospheric test is probably what you would choose. But for reasonable tactical kinds of weapons, underground testing is more than
Yeah,
sufficient.
but if you set one off on a tower in the desert, the visuals are better.
Well, true, true. I don't know what you have to gauge what your objective is.
Well,
I,
this is the regime
mhm.
that sent unarmed teenagers walking through Iraqi minefields to protect their limited stock of of tanks. This regime has done all kinds of brutal stuff. I don't think they're going to hesitate too long about dirtying up a patch of desert if they think it'll help them achieve their goals. It's
Well,
also the way that the Indians announced themselves when they exploded. What was a peaceful Buddha?
yeah, Smiling Buddha. It's the
Smiling
name
Buddha,
of their series.
uh, a somewhat macabre name for a nuclear shot.
True.
Uh, I, it's hard to predict what the Iranians will do, but it sure wouldn't surprise me that we see this explosion in the desert, and a couple of days later, it's all over Western Europe, and a week after that, we sense it at every sophisticated installation here in the United States, and people are running around tearing their hair out. I will not be tearing my hair out, partly because I don't have much hair, but also because uh, again, this stuff is easier to detect in small quantities that don't add meaningfully to radiation dose, but it sure will have a political effect.
Yeah. Well, certainly no one knows at this point,
Yeah,
and I kind of hope it doesn't go that direction. I would prefer to see it as being someone who was part of field test. I would prefer underground, experiment which can give the Iranians all the technical information they need, whether their weapon is viable, whether the design works or not.
I'd prefer we take their word for it that they can do it and negotiate something different.
Yeah, let's stop there. No, that would be great. I'd also like to slip in just a quick little mention that uh, we have a sort of hubris that everyone approach nuclear weapons the same way that we and the Russians have done, and that is the only way to approach a weapon. Um, I'm afraid that is not an entirely safe kind of assumption, at least with the passage of time. Things change in the field, just like any other technical field. And there's possibilities of other approaches that would make 60% material much more viable as a possible basis of a weapon. Uh, if you basically bootstrap fusion and fission in the right way, you can increase the tolerance of an explosive device and still end up with a reliable device uh, of respectable yield. Now, I was part of test program, and all of our efforts were to provide what DoD was asking for, and that was reliable high yield weapons. So we didn't play with things like fizzle devices, and well, except for the historical Lanel tests like GMX, that series. For the most part, we were just trying to satisfy the military and providing what they needed for, you know, what they thought they needed at least. But uh, you don't need that much of an explosion to actually pump a fusion secondary. It actually turns out that only a fairly modest explosion is enough. And 60% enrichment uranium is plenty enough to get enough of a fizzle to pump a properly designed fusion secondary. So, it wouldn't be the approach that we classically used. We make boosted weapons that use both fission and fusion. We get a more complete, burnup of the fission primary by using the fusion secondary and their neutrons to create more fissions in the fission primary. And also, you get plenty of neutrons out of the fusion side. But if you were inclined, and if all you had was 60%, and if there was some reason that you wanted to stop at that level, you could, with a more sophisticated secondary, actually create a fission, you know, fizzle, and then fusion boosted device, or, or and that very few people talk about, but that's probably very possible.
So when it comes to further developments like this is of course the reason why the U.S. and Israel are targeting Iranian scientists. Where does the operational security versus information equation, where do we get that information from? Is it sourced from their compliance? And if that compliance goes away, are these scientists better protected? Or is it other sources of intel on their program?
Yeah, boy, those are all terrible developments in my opinion. I mean, being a American that was associated with test program, even though I was a pretty small player, tell you the truth, in the overall situation, I was a trusted individual, important in technical aspects of mounting shots, but not a key player, and certainly not a designer or anything like that. But the idea that you find and target, a bunch of nuclear scientists, essentially civilians, and you assassinate them to reduce the possibility that, the opposition makes a little bit of progress. That's a hideous thing, in my opinion. And I regret that we've crossed that line now. And I think it's only reasonable to think that in the future, at some point, American scientists or Western scientists start getting targeted by the opposition. And, we see this back and forth, where, there's just unnecessary slaughter and unnecessary, waste of pretty rare talent. In the United
Well,
States,
this may be so, but you couldn't stop America from having nuclear weapons by killing nuclear weapons scientists. It's 80 years too late for that.
yeah, the amount, the knowledge, the full knowledge, design knowledge to make nuclear weapons is held in relatively few hands in the United States, and that is by intention. There are probably less than 200 individuals throughout the weapons complex that have a full view, a full and complete view, and full access to all the classified aspects of
Yes,
weapons design.
Robert, but I'd bring you back to your statement about hubris, which I think is very well taken. If Iran can develop an inefficient, dirty, crude nuclear weapon, we can look down our noses at it, but it's still a nuclear weapon. And the ability to do that does not depend on being the latest and the greatest.
Yeah, that's true. I think the Iranians are better than we typically credit them for. Their level of development is actually very respectable. They don't have the experience. We had decades of testing, nuclear testing. And, initially it wasn't that easy in the United States to actually make devices that worked. Lawrence Livermore had a terrible time the first couple of years after the laboratory was established to get a working weapon, and it was a great embarrassment to directors at the time. Lionel was the only one initially that was able to get devices that worked. So I'm not sure it would be different for the Iranians. It's not an entirely trivial matter, especially for implosion style devices, to make, really high yield weapons. But
It's a hard job to do well.
yes,
It's not such a hard job to do in a way that will still make the point.
yeah, and I think the fizzle device is actually, kind of the low tech, really entry level kind of a device that could have tremendous economic impact and psychological impact. I mean, the idea of having your whole port totally contaminated with radioactive fission products, that would be unnerving to anyone in the United States, in Israel, any place,
Robert, I think you've just coined a new classic term, the entry-level nuclear weapon.
oh, terrible. Well, I hope to not be credited with all of, as what has happened today. But that would be a terrible development.
We've got about 10 minutes. Yeah, Gabe, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. After Trump got rid of the agreement, Biden negotiated. If there was already an agreement with Obama, what was that negotiation about, and was it necessary?
Talk about returning to the JCPOA.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I did hear that there were, there was diplomatic work that was done, but my impression was that the negotiators were not, well, they sort of adopted a tactic where they didn't negotiate in a classical way. It's not sort of a give and take. It's more of a, this is what we want. We want you to agree to it. And they didn't put high level talent, that's still available in the State Department on the issues. So I just don't believe that the Iranians and the Biden administration really had serious interaction. That's the way it appeared to me, is that it wasn't a level of effort that was at such an energy level to actually come up with a result. So I think it kind of died midstream. Everyone kind of frustrated, but that's maybe not, that's reading more into it than I have firm knowledge to justify.
Do we have any final thoughts before we end the program? Matt, why don't you go?
I am interested in the what the implications are for a renaissance of nuclear energy. And I think we can draw some lessons, not from analysis, but from the actual pattern of real world events, which is the preferred simple way to a bomb is probably uranium enrichment. That's what the Pakistanis did. That's what Gaddafi was trying to do. That's what the Iranians are trying to do. It is, at the moment, the Trump administration is reviving talk of nuclear reprocessing, which means taking the old fuel, chopping it up from civil reactors, chopping it up mechanically, taking out the plutonium that was created, the uranium that wasn't fissioned, and reusing it, which sounds like a smart thing to do. Ford and then Carter rejected this because it was a pathway for non-nuclear states to get nuclear energy and then move on to become nuclear weapons states. And I think one of the subtexts of the history of the Iranian program is, nope, that's not the way people actually do it.
Right. I also certainly share some of those concerns. It hasn't maybe been fully remembered that some of the biggest environmental releases of radiation that the American program suffered was from reprocessing facilities. That's one way that we, unfortunately, reprocessing in the early days got a bad reputation as being, just a radiation producer. And I don't know that we ever had chemistry and technology sufficient to do the job without loss. I mean,
Others do. The French do.
they do now. They
Yeah,
actually,
they do now.
they for decades they had much too much of a release. They have tuned certainly their
Right.
technology, but
And if you want to find a good way to screw something up on a large scale, you follow the Soviet model. But they're gone also.
yeah, there's some very sad cases there. I'd just like to mention that thorium provides many of the same advantages of uranium plutonium as a fuel cycle, and you can get a lot of benefits from adopting thorium as your commercial basis for power generation.
We should explain that thorium is not fissile, but if it absorbs a neutron in a reactor, it is transmuted through two steps into uranium-233, which is good reactor fuel. And also, I'm afraid to say, as the Atomic Energy Commission once demonstrated, it can be weapons fuel.
Yeah, it's definitely true. At least that's my opinion and the opinion of senior designers at Lawrence Livermore Lab. To my knowledge, they came down saying that if they didn't already have plutonium designs, they would be perfectly happy to make U-233 based designs that they felt would be equivalent, just as good as the plutonium designs that they
A
On
lot
the other
harder to
hand,
do. A
if
lot
you're in
harder to do.
India and you're sitting on all that thorium,
Yeah.
easy to recover, it means you can build lots of reactors with no fuel worries.
Yeah, and one of the nice things is that in the thorium fuel cycle, you don't need a fast reactor. Normally when you do recycling and all that, you typically pass material into a fast reactor to do the cleanup and the final burn up of all the minor actinides that you've produced in the process. And with thorium, you can do it all within one thermal spectrum reactor. I happen to favor molten salt reactors. That's also a favorite of Dr. Ralph Moore, who is sort of the sorcerer that I'm the apprentice of. So long and short, thorium deserves a second look. And I guess that's something I'd like to slip in.
Well, we've solved all the world's problems.
Just moving to one new technology. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like that's going to happen soon in the US. We move forward.
Well, there's an interesting test going on now at Idaho National Laboratory. It is it's an American Indian company, Indian, using U-238 and using a little bit of HEU and using thorium. The idea is to put it in a CANDU style reactor, the Canadian reactor, where it will breed thorium in situ in the reactor. You never take it out of the reactor. It'll breed the thorium into U-233. In a Canadian style reactor, it would cut the volume of nuclear waste. You'd have about 1/7 as much waste. You'd still have the isotopes, but the volumes would be smaller. And it's a promising solution for India. Whether it ends up in production is another question, especially since the Canadians and the Indians are not talking to each other at the moment over unrelated issues. But there is work in thorium going on.
Wonderful. Any final thought?
Well, I guess I would like to say that in the long term, in the medium and long term, peace basically depends on trust. So we can come up with clever things that sort of put our opposition in a box and more or less make it so that they have to make a choice that's going to be hard for them as far as giving up their civilian nuclear program and a lot of the technology that they've spent decades, building up. They're supposed to just drop that and, just see it our way and, allow us to be the hegemon in the region. But I don't think that you can do that, especially if you do that through assassination and deceit and underhanded dark means is what it amounts to. When you resort to that, that's not the sign of a leadership, of proper leadership. That's a sign of someone who is losing their power and having to resort to foul means to get the end they want. So I just don't think that's the direction to go. That it would be better to deal upright and forthrightly with the opposition. The opposition is pretty honorable by record of the last several decades, even though I acknowledge, the problems in the 1970s and sort where the regime was radical and did crazy things. That's not the tenor of what I
Yeah.
observe right now from
Well,
Iran.
that regime is radical now, but I would put more confidence in a negotiated solution than in whack-a-mole cat and mouse bombings.
Right. Yeah, please save us from that. I would like to see building of trust, between the two sides. That's the enduring piece that makes a difference. A little bombing run success, blowing up a few centrifuges in, in a matter of decades, that's not going to be the thing that wins the day. That's not going to bring peace. That's at least my perception. It's better to lead in such a way that you create an environment of trust and you come through with your promises. You actually do what you say. That's the way to peace.
Thank you, everyone, for your contribution. The eco-modernist every day, 1 p.m. right here, Eco-Modernist channel or at Modern. You can also find us on at the Eco-Modernist Society of North America and online at ESNA.earth. Please support us on us at the Eco-Modernist channel on Patreon. Remember, and just
I want to speak to you about a new organization called the Eco-Modernist Society of North America. I'm here because we are in the midst of a potentially monumental ecological crisis. It is only through a new environmentalism 2.0 that progress can be made. We believe that our only hope for human advancement and even human survival is through the exponential advance of science in the service of humanity. Eco-modernism is a new environmental paradigm which looks to reverse the fear of nuclear power and scientific progress in general. Ecology-based modernism is the most direct way to define it. Eco-modernism as a philosophy is described in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. We believe humanity should not be rejecting technological progress, but rather separate our impacts from nature through the responsible use of technology and urbanization. Urbanization is an unstoppable worldwide trend and the best solution to many environmental problems. It offers sustainable development for the human population and is a historic antidote to both deforestation and species extinction as humans move away from using wildlife as their protein source. Vertical, urban, high-rise architecture minimizes the use of land, resources, and energy, enabling walkable cities that facilitates the more efficient use of mass public transit as well. It must be emphasized that our support for technological solutions is definitely not about defending industrial polluters, nor does our defense of technology imply that we just need to sit back and let things take care of themselves. To the contrary, we believe that humanity is at a crossroads